Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling a question that's, well, both fascinating and a little bit, I guess you could say, unsettling. Is there a connection between creativity and mental illness?
It's definitely a question that has been debated for centuries, and we're going to explore it through this book by Nassir Ghaemi. It's called A First-Rate Madness, Uncovering the Links Between Leadership and Mental Illness.
Okay, a first-rate madness. I like the title. And yeah, I got to say, right from the get-go, Ghaemi kind of throws at the curveball. He argues that some of history's most effective leaders, particularly the ones who, really thrived during times of crisis, actually exhibited signs of mental illness.
He makes a pretty compelling case. The book is just full of these surprising historical examples. But before we get too deep into those, let's maybe start with the foundation of this whole debate. You familiar with the so-called Mad Genius Thesis?
Mad
Yeah.
Genius Thesis. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. It's the idea that there's some kind of link between exceptional creativity and being, well, mentally ill.
Exactly. It's this notion that the same qualities that can, lead to artistic brilliance or like groundbreaking innovations could also be connected to mental instability.
So basically the idea that creativity and mental illness are like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, you could put it that way. And this idea, it's not new, by the way. It's been around for a long, long time. Even Aristotle, way back in ancient Greece, was speculating about the connection between, genius and madness.
Wow, Aristotle.
Yeah.
So this debate has some serious historical roots.
It does. And, there are sort of two main camps in this debate. On one side, you've got thinkers like Cesare Lombroso, who basically believe that insanity was equal to genius.
So the more troubled the mind, the more brilliant the output. Kind of
Yeah.
like the crazier, the better.
That was Lombroso's perspective, yeah.
Yeah.
But then, you've got someone like Francis Galton, who was like this pioneer in statistics and genetics. He took the opposite view. He argued that sanity, a sound mind, that was the foundation of genius.
So a healthy mind leads to great achievements. That's a pretty different take.
Yeah, it's a fundamental disagreement that's, still at the heart of the debate today. Does genius come from a sound mind or a troubled one? It's a really big question.
And it seems like Ghaemi kind of falls on the troubled mind side of things, at least when it comes to leadership.
Oh, yeah, you could say that. But he's very specific about the types of mental illness that he believes are linked to effective leadership. And it's really about how these conditions can actually be beneficial in, certain contexts, like especially during crises.
So he's not saying that every mental illness is going to make you a great leader.
No, definitely not. In fact, he says that some mental illnesses can actually be pretty debilitating for leaders, especially those that involve, psychosis or like a detachment from reality.
Yeah, that makes sense. So which mental illnesses does he see as potentially beneficial then for leaders, I mean?
He focuses mainly on depression, mania, and bipolar disorder. And he kind of breaks down how these conditions can foster like 4 key qualities of crisis leadership.
4 key qualities. Okay, I'm intrigued. What are they?
He talks about realism, resilience, empathy, and creativity.
Realism, resilience, empathy, and creativity. Okay, I'm following so far. But I got to ask, how can depression, which we usually associate with, sadness and negativity, actually be helpful for a leader? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
Well, Ghaemi argues that depression can lead to this thing called depressive realism.
Depressive realism. Okay, now I'm really curious. What is that?
Basically, it's the idea that people with depression, they tend to have a more accurate view of the world. Maybe not a more optimistic view, but definitely more accurate. They're less likely to fall for like illusions of control or to overestimate their abilities.
So they see things more clearly, even if it's a bit of a bleaker picture.
Exactly. And that kind of clear-eyed perspective, it can be super valuable for a leader, especially when they're facing a crisis. They're not going to sugarcoat things or make promises they can't keep. You know what I mean?
That actually reminds me of this study Ghaemi mentions in the book. It was about this illusion of control thing that researchers had these students trying to like predict coin tosses, but they secretly rigged some early successes for certain students just to see what would happen.
Ah, yeah, the classic coin toss study. I love that one. So what happened?
Well, the students who got those rigged successes, especially the ones who weren't depressed, they developed this like inflated sense of control. They thought they were actually good at predicting random events.
It's amazing how easily our brains can trick us, right? And how, like, a lack of that depressive realism, can lead to overconfidence. It's a classic example.
So it sounds like a dose of depression, or at least a healthy dose of realism, might actually be a good thing for making smart decisions, especially when times are tough.
That's one of Ghaemi's main points for sure. He even suggests that there might be, like, a Goldilocks principle at work here. Finding that sweet spot between too much illusion and too much despair.
Interesting. That makes a lot of sense. But what about mania? How can that possibly be beneficial for a leader? It just seems like it would be, a recipe for a disaster.
It can be, definitely. But Ghaemi argues that mania, with all that, impulsivity and heightened energy, it can actually fuel creativity and resilience. And those are both pretty crucial for leadership.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly. Mania can lead to these incredible bursts of energy and, like, totally innovative thinking, but it can also lead to recklessness and really bad judgment if it's not, channeled in the right direction.
And what about bipolar disorder, where you have those, swings between depression and mania? How does that fit into Ghaemi's theory?
Well, he suggests that bipolar disorder, because it involves cycling between these two states, could actually foster all four of those key leadership qualities we talked about: the realism from the depressive phases, and then the resilience, empathy, and creativity from the manic phases.
So it's almost like having the best of both worlds, although obviously it's a very challenging condition to actually live with.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue, but it's a fascinating idea, and Gain backs it up with some pretty compelling historical examples, like real-world leaders who might have exhibited these traits.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Let's dive into those examples. Who does he start with?
One of the most prominent figures he discusses is General William Tecumseh Sherman, from the American Civil War.
Oh, yeah,
Hmm?
Sherman. I remember learning about him in school. But what was so mad genius about him?
Well, Sherman was known for being pretty bold, even ruthless, some might say. His military strategies were definitely unconventional, to say the least, like his famous March to the Sea.
Yeah, the March to the Sea. Wasn't that basically just him, burning everything in his path?
It was more than just destruction, though. Sherman's goal was to completely break the South's will to fight. And he did that by targeting not just their army, but also their morale and their entire infrastructure. It was as much a psychological tactic as it was a military one.
So it was like a total war strategy, aimed at crushing the enemy's spirit.
Exactly. And Ghaemi believes that this unconventional and, frankly, pretty brutal approach was connected to Sherman's mental state.
Interesting. So what's the evidence for that?
Well, Ghaemi presents evidence from, like, Sherman's own writings, and also accounts from people who knew him that suggest Sherman experienced manic episodes. Things like pacing, insomnia, talking obsessively, rapid shifts in mood, all classic signs of mania.
Wow, so Ghaemi's arguing that Sherman's manic energy and his out-of-the-box thinking actually helped him succeed militarily.
That's exactly what he's saying. And this is where the whole mad genius idea really comes into play. It wasn't just that Sherman was like a brilliant military strategist. It was his willingness to, push the boundaries, to think differently than everyone else. That's what set him apart.
So in Sherman's case, his possible mania was actually an asset, at least in the context of war.
Yeah, that's how Ghaemi sees it. And it's worth noting that the historian Michael Fellman, who wrote a whole biography about Sherman, he also concluded that Sherman's mental illness, specifically bipolar disorder, played a big role in his military creativity.
Yeah, so that's one point for the mad genius theory. Who else does Ghaemi use to support his argument?
He discusses a bunch of different leaders from different time periods and, different fields. But another really interesting example is Ted Turner, the media mogul, who founded CNN.
Ted Turner. Oh, yeah. I definitely know who he is. Wasn't he kind of a wild man?
He had that reputation, for sure. Always full of energy, big ideas, never afraid to take risks. And Ghaemi argues that all that boundless energy, his risk-taking personality, and just his constant stream of, innovative ideas, they were probably driven by manic traits.
I could see that. Turner was always pushing boundaries, shaking things up, never content with the status quo.
Exactly. He revolutionized the media landscape with CNN, and he did it by, constantly challenging conventions, taking big risks. And Ghaemi suggests that those qualities were fueled, at least in part, by his manic tendencies.
And he's eventually diagnosed with bipolar disorder, right?
Yeah, that's right. And his story also kind of highlights the tragic side of mental illness. His father, who also had these, mood swings. He ended up dying by suicide, probably influenced by misdiagnosis and, just inadequate treatment back then.
It's a good reminder that mental illness is, a very complex issue. And even though it can be linked to creativity and, even success, it can also come with some very real challenges and risks.
Absolutely. And Ghaemi acknowledges that. He's not trying to romanticize mental illness at all. He's just trying to understand, how it can manifest in different ways and how it can sometimes lead to these extraordinary achievements, especially in the context of leadership.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got a Civil War general and a media mogul. Who else is on Ghaemi's list?
Well, let's talk about Winston Churchill. Ghaemi thinks he might have had a cyclothymic personality.
Cyclothymic. Now, I have to admit, I'm not familiar with that term. What exactly does that mean?
It basically means he experienced these frequent shifts between kind of mild highs and lows. It's different from the more extreme swings you see in like full-blown bipolar disorder.
So, less intense, but still, noticeable fluctuations in mood.
Exactly. And his personal physician, Lord Moran, he kept these really detailed accounts of Churchill's, his frequent bouts of despair, times when he'd just declare himself finished.
Wow. It's hard to imagine someone like Churchill, known for his strength and resilience, struggling with those kinds of feelings.
It's a good reminder that even the most outwardly confident people can have their internal battles. And it's interesting to compare his leadership during World War II with Neville Chamberlain's approach of appeasement.
Chamberlain, who just wanted to avoid war at all costs.
Yeah. Exactly. And Ghaemi argues that Chamberlain, who was a classic, what he calls a homoclite, someone who's mentally healthy, he lacked the kind of realism and determination that Churchill, maybe because of his cyclothymic personality, brought to the situation.
So Chamberlain's, his normalcy was actually a disadvantage.
That's Ghaemi's argument, yeah. He's saying that Churchill's struggles with his mental state, his black dog, as he called his depression, might have actually helped him be a better wartime leader.
Wow, that's fascinating. So we've got three very different leaders, all potentially benefiting from their mental differences. This is getting more and more interesting by the minute. Who's next on Ghaemi's list? Who's the next mad genius?
Let's move on to a leader who's, probably even more iconic than Churchill, Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln. Okay, now this I got to hear. What does Ghaemi say about Honest Abe?
Well, Lincoln's melancholy was very well documented. He was known for being, pretty somber and introspective.
Yeah, and he lived through some incredibly tough times.
Yeah.
The Civil War was, it was brutal and incredibly divisive.
For sure. And Ghaemi points to accounts from people who knew Lincoln describing his low moods, his trouble sleeping, even thoughts of suicide.
Wow, are we talking like clinical depression here?
Ghaemi thinks it's likely that Lincoln suffered from, recurrent severe depression. And he explores the possibility that this depression, with its tendency towards, realism, might have actually helped Lincoln navigate all the complexities of the Civil War.
So his depression might have actually made him a better leader instead of, holding him back.
That's what Ghaemi's arguing, yeah. He's saying that Lincoln's his depressive realism allowed him to see the challenges of the war very clearly and to understand the stakes and to make these incredibly difficult decisions with, a sober mind.
It's amazing to think that a condition that we often, associate with weakness and despair could actually be a source of strength and wisdom, at least in certain situations.
It definitely challenges our assumptions about mental illness, doesn't it? And it forces us to consider that maybe, just maybe, what we see as abnormal might actually be beneficial in certain contexts.
I like that. Okay, so far we've got a general, a media mogul, a wartime prime minister, and now the president who led the nation through the Civil War. That's an impressive list of mad geniuses. Does Ghaemi have any more examples up his sleeve?
He does. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about two leaders who championed nonviolent resistance, Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr.
Gandhi and King. Wow, now those are names that are, practically synonymous with peace and compassion. How do they fit into this mad genius idea?
Well, both Gandhi and King were known to suffer from depression, and they both really made empathy like the core of their political philosophies.
Yeah, I can see that. Their messages were all about understanding, forgiveness, seeing the humanity in everyone, even your enemies.
Right. And Ghaemi talks about their concept of agape. It's this Greek word that basically means like this redemptive goodwill for all. And it really formed the basis of their whole, nonviolent resistance movements.
It's a powerful idea, but actually practicing nonviolent resistance, that must have been so incredibly difficult, especially when they were facing, violence and oppression themselves.
Absolutely. It takes a tremendous amount of mental and emotional strength to not give in to like those natural impulses of anger and aggression, to meet hatred with love and compassion instead. It's remarkable.
And Ghaemi's suggesting that their experiences with depression, that might have actually deepened their empathy and fueled their commitment to nonviolence.
That's his argument, yeah. He's saying that their struggles with their own inner darkness, it gave them a much deeper understanding of human suffering and a greater capacity for compassion.
That's a beautiful, albeit kind of melancholy idea. So even in the pursuit of peace and justice, there might be a role for what we might call madness.
It seems that way. Ghaemi's examples really make us reconsider our assumptions about mental illness and, its relationship to leadership, to creativity, even to morality.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking. But before we go any further down this rabbit hole of mad genius, we need to take a quick break.
Okay.
When we come back, we'll delve into even more fascinating examples from Ghaemi's book and really explore the complexities of this whole debate. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. Before the break, we were digging into Nassir Ghaemi's First-Rate Madness and how some mental traits, the ones we often think of as, bad things, could actually help leaders, especially in tough situations.
We were just talking about Gandhi and King and how their struggles with depression could have actually fueled their incredible empathy in their leadership when they faced, well, just unbelievable adversity.
Yeah, it really makes you think differently about those traits, What we see as weaknesses might be strengths in a different light. So where do we go from here? Who else does Ghaemi talk about to support his idea?
Well, let's talk about resilience. It's another super important thing for a successful leader, especially when things get rough. Ghaemi has this interesting idea he calls the stealing effect.
Okay, stealing effect. Sounds tough. What's that all about?
Basically, it's the idea that if you're exposed to hardship, but in a controlled way, it can actually build up your resilience. Kind of like how vaccines work for our immune systems. You develop a tolerance for stress and tough times by gradually getting used to it.
So it's like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but you're doing it on purpose.
Yeah, but it has to be controlled, It's not about purposely going through trauma or putting yourself in danger. It's more about learning how to deal with challenges and setbacks in a healthy way so you can bounce back stronger.
Right, learning how to cope. That makes sense. And Ghaemi connects this stealing effect to a specific personality type, right?
He does. He thinks there might be a connection between something called a hyperthymic personality, which is kind of a milder form of mania, and being more resilient.
Hyperthymic personality. Refresh my memory. What does that look like again?
People with hyperthymic personalities are usually really energetic, optimistic, always driven. Those are definitely traits that can help someone get through tough times.
So they're like the Energizer bunnies of personalities. They just keep going and going.
That's a good way to put it. They have this natural energy and drive that keeps them moving forward, even when there are obstacles in the way. And Ghaemi uses two really famous presidents as examples of this, Franklin D. Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy.
FDR and JFK. Okay, now those are names everyone knows. What's the connection to hyperthemia?
Well, both of them faced some serious challenges, both personal and political. Roosevelt, had polio, and Kennedy had health problems all his life.
Yeah, and they led during some pretty intense times, too. The Depression, World War II, the Cold War. Those were some stressful years.
Exactly. And Ghaemi thinks that maybe their hyperthymic personalities, combined with their own struggles, actually made them super resilient. It allowed them to connect with people and be effective leaders during really tough times.
So it's like they used their energy and optimism to do good, even when things were incredibly difficult.
Yeah, that's how Ghaemi sees it. He says their madness, in a way, was actually a strength. It inspired them and the whole nation.
So we've talked about depression, mania, bipolar disorder, and now hyperthymia, all connected to successful leadership in different ways. But there's this one guy we haven't talked about yet. It's hard to avoid him when we're talking about this topic.
You're talking about Adolf Hitler, right?
Exactly. We can't really talk about leadership and mental illness without mentioning him.
It's a sensitive topic, no question, and it's complicated. But Ghaemi doesn't avoid it. He has a whole chapter on Hitler. He analyzes his mental state and how it might have affected what he did.
So what's Ghaemi's take? Does he think Hitler was driven by mental illness?
He looked at tons of historical records and medical stuff, and he concluded that Hitler probably had bipolar disorder, and it was likely made worse because he was using intravenous amphetamines.
Intravenous amphetamines. Wow, that doesn't sound good for mental stability.
Not at all. Ghaemi thinks that having bipolar disorder plus the drugs probably made Hitler act erratically, made him paranoid, and fueled his sense of, like, his own importance.
That's a scary thought. But even if Hitler was mentally ill, does that excuse what he did?
No, absolutely not. Ghaemi's very clear about that. He says we have to separate a medical diagnosis from a moral judgment.
Right, just because someone has a mental illness doesn't mean they're not responsible for their actions.
Exactly. A diagnosis isn't a free pass. It helps us understand someone's behavior and their mental state, but that's it. With Hitler, it's obvious that a lot of things influenced what he did. His ideology, his ambition, his messed up view of the world, it's not simple.
So mental illness might have been part of who Hitler was and how he acted, but it doesn't explain the Holocaust or the other terrible things that happened under his leadership.
Exactly. It's way too simplistic to say mental illness caused the Holocaust. We can't reduce it to just that.
Agreed. It's a tragedy with a long history and a lot of factors that led to it. But Ghaemi's analysis of Hitler does make you think about mental health and leadership, especially during those really difficult times.
It does. And it brings us to another interesting idea Ghaemi talks about. Homoclites.
Homoclites, that's a new one. What are those?
They're basically people who are considered mentally healthy. They represent what's considered normal in terms of mental well-being.
So they're the opposite of the mad geniuses we've been talking about.
Kind of, yeah. But Ghaemi throws us another curveball. He says these mentally healthy leaders, these homoclites, might actually be less effective during crises.
Wait, really? So being mentally healthy could be a bad thing for a leader?
That's what Ghaemi suggests, and he has research to back it up. He talks about studies that show homoclites, even though they're mentally healthy, can have trouble making good decisions when there's a lot of stress and uncertainty.
So they might be fine when things are normal, but they fall apart under pressure.
Exactly. They might make conflicts worse, or they might not take action when they need to.
That's really interesting and kind of surprising. We usually think mental health is a good thing, especially for a leader.
We do, but Ghaemi is making us think differently. He says that some of the things we see in mental illness, like realism, resilience, empathy, and creativity, can actually help leaders, especially in a crisis.
So maybe it's not about being mad or sane. Maybe it's about having the right mix of qualities for whatever's happening.
That's a great way to put it. It's not like one mental state is perfect for leadership. Different situations need different things, and sometimes those things might come from people who have, unconventional mental traits.
It's like the human mind is this huge spectrum, and what's normal or abnormal really depends on the person in the situation.
Right. And Ghaemi's book is making us think about all of this, challenge what we think about mental illness and how it fits into society. He's not saying mental illness is good or that we should romanticize it. He just wants us to understand mental health better and be more compassionate.
It's about realizing that everyone's different, and that's okay. And maybe, just maybe, some of those things we connect with, mental illness, realism, resilience, empathy, creativity, are actually what we need to deal with the world's problems, especially when things are really tough.
That's a powerful thought, and it's something that stays with you after you read Ghaemi's book. I think everyone should check out A First-Rate Madness. It really makes you think about mental illness and leadership in a whole new way.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating book that challenges our assumptions and makes us rethink what it means to be human. Maybe it'll even inspire us to be more accepting of people who think and feel differently. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into A First-Rate Madness. We hope you found it as interesting as we did. Until next time, keep those mad genius conversations going. Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis.
Yeah.
We've been spending this episode with Nassir Ghaemi's A First-Rate Madness. It's really got us thinking about how, those mental traits that we usually think of as downsides might actually be upsides for leaders, especially when they're dealing with crises.
And right before the break, we were just getting into some really interesting examples of leaders that Ghaemi compares. The ones who are considered mentally healthy, those homoclites he talks about, compared to the leaders who showed signs of mental illness. It's a pretty fascinating contrast.
Yeah, it's where the rubber meets the road, right?
Mm-hmm.
So who are some of these leaders Ghaemi uses to show that difference between homoclites and the ones with, a first-rate madness?
Well, he kicks it off with a comparison that really jumps out at you, especially since we were just talking about it. Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill. Remember how we were discussing Churchill's possible cyclothymia
Mm.
and how his struggles with depression, what he called his black dog, could have actually given him a more realistic and ultimately more effective way of handling Hitler.
Yeah, definitely. It's like Chamberlain just wanted to keep things peaceful no matter what. But Churchill, maybe because of his mental state, he saw the danger of Hitler more clearly. And he was the one who could get the country ready to fight back against, fascism.
That's exactly what Ghaemi's getting at. He's saying that Chamberlain, a total homoclite, meaning mentally healthy, was missing that foresight, that determination that Churchill had, maybe because of his, cyclothymic personality. Those were the things that were needed in that situation.
So being normal, in Chamberlain's case, was almost like a weakness, at least when you're up against a guy like Hitler.
That's how Ghaemi sees it. And it really shows how there's no one right way to be a leader. Different times call for different skills, and sometimes those skills come from unexpected places.
Absolutely. And Ghaemi actually brings up another great example from the Civil War. We were talking about General Sherman, the one who did the March to the Sea, and how his bold tactics, you could even say ruthless tactics, might have been fueled by his manic episodes.
Yeah, Sherman was definitely a force of nature. Well, Ghaemi compares him to another Union general, George McClellan, who was known for being very cautious and indecisive. McClellan, even though he was mentally healthy, couldn't get those big wins. He never managed to capture Richmond, which was the Confederate capital.
It's like, while Sherman's out there burning Atlanta and marching across Georgia, McClellan's stuck in neutral.
Pretty much. And Ghaemi's point is that McClellan's normalcy, that lack of what you might call, creative madness, might have actually held him back as a military leader.
It makes you think, right? Maybe those unconventional traits, that willingness to take risks, to think differently, maybe those are what you need to really shake things up and get big results, especially in a crisis.
That's a big part of what Ghaemi's getting at. And he doesn't just stick to military leaders. He brings in political figures, too, like Richard Nixon. He was obviously a brilliant strategist and politician, but he also had that tendency towards paranoia and being vindictive.
Yeah, Nixon. He's such a complicated guy. Smart, no question. But his dark side really messed things up in the end.
Absolutely. And Ghaemi suggests that even though Nixon's paranoia caused problems, it also might have helped him get ahead politically, like being able to outmaneuver his rivals.
That's like a double-edged sword, right? It's the same thing that makes you great can also destroy you.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance. And Ghaemi doesn't pretend it's simple. He also looks at how leaders like George W. Bush and Tony Blair made decisions, especially leading up to the Iraq War.
Oh, yeah, the Iraq War. That was a huge decision and a really controversial one. What does Ghaemi say about that?
He argues that both Bush and Blair, even though they were mentally healthy, maybe didn't see the situation realistically enough. Maybe they overestimated their own control over things and didn't fully grasp how bad the consequences could be.
So again, it's like their normalcy, that lack of skepticism or maybe even pessimism, that could have led them to make some bad choices.
That's the idea. And it all comes back to Ghaemi's main point. Mental illness, or at least some of the traits we see as negative, can sometimes be a good thing for leaders, especially in times of crisis.
It's a really interesting argument. And after hearing all these examples, you start to wonder if he's right.
He makes you think, for sure. Ghaemi's book really challenges the way we think about mental illness and how it fits into society. He's not saying mental illness is a positive thing. He just wants us to understand mental health in a more complex and compassionate way.
It's about recognizing that the human mind isn't black and white. What we think of as normal or abnormal can change depending on the person and the situation.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, some of those things we associate with mental illness, like realism, resilience, empathy, creativity, maybe those are the things we actually need to handle the world's challenges, especially when things get really tough.
That's a pretty powerful idea, and it really stays with you. I definitely recommend everyone read A First-Rate Madness. It's an amazing look at how mental illness and leadership connect.
It's a book that makes you question your assumptions and see the potential in everyone, even those who think and feel differently.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into A First-Rate Madness. We hope you found it as fascinating and thought-provoking as we did. And until next time, keep thinking about the mad genius within us all.